Well, would you look at this? What an interesting start to the season we've had with Clemson beginning 2-2, the entire Pac-12 showing out just a year before they dissolve. And now we've got Clemson coming out, and there's this report saying they could leave the ACC sooner than later. Clemson, will they announce a departure from the ACC? Could the Tigers have found a way out of the ACC? A new report says the chances are good, and this seems not surprising at all. Now, the next big question is, where is Clemson going to go? I'm going to read this article and react to it. Could Clemson be on its way out of the ACC after years of watching other schools and conferences consolidate power around the country? Reports have surfaced that Clemson may be the next team on the move. And this is coming from a reporter who put out an article. This is a South Carolina reporter, I believe, that quoted an unnamed Clemson senior administrator answering the question of whether a Clemson announcement regarding leaving the ACC could come soon. And the administrator said, quote, "Stay very tuned, sooner than later." So maybe he's referencing and saying this is possibly going to happen during the season. What a mess this would be. Normally when it comes to realignment, it pretty much always happens late June and all throughout July when it comes to college football, at least the past two seasons or the past two off seasons. And that's what we expected this off season as well. But I will say they did just get it under the gun there in August with the ACC adding those three teams, Stanford, Cal, and SMU. And I think it was a combination of things that led to that, decision to add those teams. This is probably the biggest one. It seems like there's some way out. And my prediction has always been, with ESPN's relationship with the SEC and the ACC, everyone's wondering, FSU, Clemson, could they potentially be headed to the Big Ten? It doesn't make sense. I don't think ESPN would let that happen. Now, this article does not mention at all how they would get out of the grant of rights. The theory has always been they would need 8 teams to vote to completely dissolve the grant of rights, and then those teams would be free to move to different conferences. But this article makes no reference of how it's going to get done. My, hypothesis would be that ESPN knows this is inevitable. They know Clemson and FSU and some of these other teams are getting screwed. So they've done the proactive thing. They've added a few teams. Guys, remember, Stanford, Cal, and even SMU joining the conference right now really doesn't make any sense if you're just looking at like travel, is this team going to improve our conference? Stanford and Cal really, outside of academics, are not that hot of a ticket, and that's why they're not getting their full share for like 7 or 8 years. SMU isn't getting their share until like year 9 or something. So they added those teams because they pretty much knew they were going to lose Clemson and FSU, and obviously if Clemson is gone, FSU will be as well. Now, I don't know if it's going to happen during the season. This administrator seems to be hinting that it possibly could, depending. And then it says, according to Ryan, this implies that Clemson has found a way out of the grant of rights that was holding them in the ACC for the time being. It's unclear if this would also mean the same for Florida State. I'm guessing there's some type of deal that's been worked out, probably with the help of ESPN, because again, they own the major rights, the major TV rights to the ACC and the SEC. ESPN could say, listen, we're going to give you a better deal in terms of buying yourself out of this grant of rights, but you need to go to the SEC. You need to go to the SEC, and then we're going to for sure go to the 9-game conference schedule, with the future, I think, for ESPN saying that possibly we want a 10-game in-conference schedule. The Big Ten will go to a 10-game in-conference schedule at some point, considering they're already at 18 teams and expanding even more. I think they want to get to 20. Maybe they target a team like Miami if both Clemson and FSU go to the SEC. But to me, I'm looking at this and I'm seeing two options. I'm seeing they somehow got their buyout lowered, probably through the help of ESPN, with the promise that both of these teams will not leave ESPN networks, meaning they're going to go to the SEC and not the Big Ten, or there was some type of like 8 teams coming together, but I'm not even sure if that's possible anymore, or what was it, like the Magnificent Seven or the Magnificent Eight? with the teams joining the conference, Cal, Stanford, SMU, obviously they're not going to vote to leave the conference they're about to join, and they will be making, I guess, more. Well, actually, I don't think they're going to be making more money. No, they're not. But those teams really didn't have a choice, or they could have ended up like Washington State and Oregon State, and obviously Stanford and Cal did not want that. I had thought maybe Stanford would consider joining the Big Ten. I think the reason Stanford to the Big Ten never happened, Stanford just doesn't make enough money. And Big Ten already has academic powers, and they already have teams in California, and they've already mitigated the travel concern where you were talking about 2 teams in California. That's why I said a West Wing was coming to the Big Ten, and it happens the next offseason. And this is inevitable as long as they can get out of the grant of rights, or even if they're just sniffing around this and saying it's going to happen at some point. And maybe Clemson and FSU can leverage possibly saying, we can pay whatever, because in the long run, this grant of rights deal is so bad, we'll pay a massive buyout to join the Big Ten ASAP, and you'll lose us. The SEC will lose both of those teams, and the SEC doesn't want that, and ESPN doesn't want that. Remember, this is big for the SEC to get these 2 teams. When you look at the college football landscape, it looks very pro Big Ten. Now, you could say, well, Washington's just having one great year. They've got a senior quarterback. He's going to be leaving. They might have 3 or 4 first-round picks. You know, USC, I think, will be good for a while as long as Lincoln Riley is in college, but we don't know how long that's going to be. Caleb Williams, obviously, will be gone after this year. You're going to have Oregon, who looks really good right now. They're another team with a senior quarterback, Bo Nix. So these teams are going to come back down to earth a little bit next year when they join the Big Ten. But if you look at the top 10 right now, and you put in teams that are currently in the Big Ten and future Big Ten teams, you're looking at 6 teams inside the top 9, I believe. Those were the numbers: Ohio State, obviously Penn State, Michigan, and then you also do have teams like Washington, Oregon, USC, and it's not like UCLA is this bad team. And by the way, UCLA is going to be really good with Dante Moore and the experience he's getting right now as a true freshman when they join the Big Ten, when he's a sophomore and a junior. So the SEC, this is very big that they respond to this, because you can kind of feel things starting to shift pro Big Ten. And obviously the SEC, they want to keep that exclusive footprint in the South. That's the whole thing. You see the Big Ten going all over the place. They have to create the West Wing just to make travel easier. And the SEC is saying, we're just going to stay in the South. That's our brand. That's what we want to be known for. We're not going to do this crazy thing where we create this conference that really is a mega full conference across America. It doesn't make sense. So that's why I think FSU and Clemson, they're perfect fits for the SEC, and maybe even a team like Miami. You're also looking at potentially North Carolina as well if they wanted to go from 16 to 20, and then the Big Ten would respond by going to 20 themselves. And who would the Big Ten look at? Well, they would obviously look at a team like Notre Dame. You know, that's a different conversation, you know, for another day, but they would look at Notre Dame. They would look at a team like North Carolina and probably Virginia, depending on if both Clemson and FSU do go to the SEC. And again, I know people have been saying, well, FSU might want to go to the Big Ten. I just don't see that happening based on the situation with ESPN. If ESPN controls the rights of both the SEC and the ACC, and there's a massive buyout, unless there's some crazy legal loophole that can allow Clemson and FSU to skate free just with no buyout or no crazy buyout, and it gives them the option of joining whatever conference they want, certainly they could opt for the Big Ten, because technically the Big Ten will be making more money, and they're going to, then the SEC and the Big Ten would make even more money with the additions of Clemson and Florida State, but also the SEC would. I think this is a situation where Clemson and FSU, whenever it happens, you know, we really don't want it to happen during the season. This is kind of an off-season type topic to talk about. But, you know, it's just strange to hear this, and now it's Clemson. We always heard they were behind the scenes, and it was really FSU pounding the table to get out of the conference. That's why FSU was the leader in all the headlines. And people were saying, Clemson is doing the exact same thing. They're just being way more quiet about it. And this might be another little leak that leads us to believe Clemson will be leaving maybe even before the end of the season if this administrator is right. You know, this could just be someone, it's anonymous, so you can really say whatever you want. But I don't think anyone is really surprised by this development. Clemson trying to get out of the ACC with their future horrible TV deal through 2036, where you're going to have teams like Northwestern and Maryland making virtually 40% more, double of what Clemson is making in 2029 and 2030. And then it gets worse for the ACC because the Big Ten, and I also believe the SEC, will be going to the negotiating table before this horrible contract is up. And also we're dealing with inflation. Whenever you get your next TV contract, it's normally going to be more unless your teams really depreciate in overall value. And that's not going to happen to the Big Ten. The Big Ten, when they get their next deal in the early 2030s, it's going to be so much more than the ACC. That's why Clemson and FSU are looking at this and saying the window is clearly next year, or maybe even it's in a few months whenever it ends up happening. Clemson and FSU will be out, very likely, in my opinion, headed to the SEC. And that would give the SEC the same number of teams as the Big Ten, and then they possibly go to 20, maybe 24 is the final number, but I think 20 could also be the final number, and that will enable them to fully go to like a minimum nine, especially the SEC. They're going to be going to a 9-game conference schedule next year. They were possibly going to do it this year, but there was an issue, in terms of some things. So it'll happen next year. The Big Ten will go to 10 games, and then the SEC will go to 10 games if they expand to 24 teams and become a mega conference. And you would just have a 2 games non-conference schedule. And, the argument would be, well, that's stale. You're facing the same teams. You're really not. If you're in a 24-team conference, again, this is what I always say. Like Ohio State at UCLA in the Rose Bowl, that's considered a conference game. How hilarious is that? You guys want to know a good example? Like Oklahoma at Cincinnati. That's considered a conference game right now. And it clearly feels like a non-conference game just because these teams, well, honestly, they're only going to be in the same conference 1 year. That's the funny scheduling thing with the Big 12 making the quick move to add those 3 teams, into their conference after losing Texas and Oklahoma. Those 3 teams are already in the conference. Texas and Oklahoma are still in, so they're going to face each other a few times before Texas and Oklahoma join the SEC next year. Just kind of a funny little thing there. But overall, we will see if this develops any further. It is a little bit surprising that, this is just a rumor, I guess, but we knew that it was going to be Clemson and FSU. It was always FSU taking up the headlines. But either way, guys, that is going to do it for this video. Make sure you're following me on X. Link to that's always in the description.